And like with survival and other primitive skills, where you live, your access to land is going to depend on how much you can practice tracking. I'm on public land right now, and it's on a weekday. No one's here for the most part, a few vehicles driving past. With tracking, you are going to draw attention to yourself, which is something I don't like to do. If you're kind of crawling on your hands and knees, it's just something to keep in mind. You're not breaking any laws, but it just raises eyebrows, and I try to avoid that. So I like to track on my land, but since I'm traveling for work, I have to make use of the public areas. I just try to go places where no one's here, because last thing you want, just like in my other video mentioning practicing skills in state parks, you just don't want to attract attention to yourself to where people think you're up to no good. Generally speaking, across the board in the tracking community, folks that live in sandy areas such as the Bedouins in the Middle East, the Bushmen of the Kalahari in Africa, and then some of the Indian tribes in the western United States, you consider those to be the best trackers in the world, because sandy areas make it very easy to read and interpret tracks. And here in Pennsylvania, most areas aren't sandy, maybe along some of the creek beds and some of the man-made lakes. For the most part, you got to go somewhere. Here there's a volleyball court, and it just rained, so this is a good area for tracking. I'm kind of painting a broad brush, tongue twister here, with tracking, but in general, you have following the sign, trailing, whatever you want to call it, track aging, and track interpretation. So the sandy areas are definitely where you're going to want to go to if you're trying to practice track interpretation. There's a number of books that'll cover this. I highly recommend Tom Brown's Field Guide to Tracking. He will really go into detail on track speed. Essentially, the foot steps, pushes off, and then you're left reading that. He has a number of different terminology that there's no need to go over in the video. When you're looking at things like that, that's generally your speed. For turns, you're going to be looking at things like that. The books will explain the science behind track interpretation, but really what it comes down to is just getting out here and practicing. Walking, what it looks like. Running, what it looks like. Turning, what that looks like. How fast. Different kinds of footwear. As you move away from sand, you can start practicing the more difficult soil types. Here's kind of a transition between sandy, gravelly rock into grass. And then you can move into the woods. So each different soil type has its advantages and its disadvantages as far as ease in track trailing and interpretation, but generally grassy and then areas of a lot of leaf litter and pine tend to be difficult for most people. I highly recommend that you have a secondary spot in mind to practice tracking, and also to the primitive skills, like one of the other videos where I was discussing practicing survival skills in a state park. But earlier today, whenever I was filming the tracking at the volleyball court, people in the state park just kept driving past. Some pulled over, stopped where they're gawking at me, and it was just annoying and awkward. So I just left and decided to stop at a park after I got done running. This is a township park. You can hear traffic going by. It's not remote, but there's nice woods here. Lots of trails. It's going to be fun to explore, and it's not very crowded. So I'm going to go ahead and check it out. Anytime you come to a new area, you want to find what are called track traps. A track trap is any place, whether it's sand, mud, clay, some place where tracks show up very nice. You want to go ahead and find those areas. The bigger the better. Sometimes they're along the edge of the trail, along water, just bare areas, depending on the environment that you live in. Depends on how big the size is. So here in the eastern woodlands, being in a forested area, there's not going to be as many, but along the edges of the trails, kind of muddy areas. Back in 2002, when I first started to learn tracking every day after work, I was living in Virginia Beach, and there was this inlet. It was by the Lessener Bridge. For those of you that are familiar with the Virginia Beach area, there was this inlet. I don't know if it was public or private land. It was kind of like the commons, because everybody used it. People walked their dogs, went jogging, so forth. It was probably, I'd say, a 3 or 4 acre area, and all sandy, little patches of woods here and there, but it was great for tracking. And I used to go there and spend hours after work and just studying tracks, try to get off the beaten path away from folks, just that way, you know, people weren't gawking and staring and so forth like they were at the state park today. And because there was so much activity, you could look at human tracks and try to determine were they walking, were they jogging. Look at the dog tracks. Was it a person, you know, walking their dog, or were they jogging with their dog? And then of course at the top of most people's list there was the tracking of wildlife. And the most abundant animal there is rabbit. And that's not usually one that is top of the list, especially folks that are hunters. But I'll tell you what, I learned a lot from tracking rabbits. And, you know, it wasn't as sexy as tracking an elk or a bear. But I'll tell you, like, just, it taught me a ton by tracking in different types of sand, the soft sand, the damp sand, hard packed. And I really had to study, you know, how many toes, how big the footprints were. A lot of times, the only part of the track that I could see was the claw marks. And so that taught me a powerful lesson in tracking, is that the track doesn't always show up. In fact, a lot of times, especially in areas like this, you're not going to have a full-size track. And in humans, a lot of times all you're going to have is just this horseshoe mark of the heel. And for rabbits, it was the claw marks. And it also taught me too, for studying, you know, dogs, a lot of times just the front claw marks of those in the hard pack. That's all you'd be able to see. So don't discount it. If you're in an area and the only thing you have is squirrel, then track squirrels, study squirrels. It doesn't have to be some big game animal. I mean, if you have the opportunity to track deer and elk and bear, go ahead, absolutely. But if you go to a state park, a city park, and all there are is squirrels, rabbits, take the opportunity to do that. These videos that I'm making, they're to be supplemental and not substitutes. I've had folks, and I appreciate the compliments, through the years who've recommended that I've opened up survival school. But there's still so many out there, depending on what school of thought that you're after. There's so many good instructors out there that just, I personally don't feel the need, because, you know, maybe if they get old and die and nobody opens things up, then I might consider it. But right now I just want to kind of supplement and add to, you know, maybe inspire, and you know, hopefully not take away from anything that they're doing, because I highly recommend that if you get the chance and you have the money, go attend a school in person, especially a tracking school. So another thing is, I'd say probably half of what I learned was from listening to stories of folks that have tracked, and just them telling the different experiences and what they saw, what they observed, and then reading books. When I was in the inlet tracking rabbits, I got a field guide, and when it would be raining or I would be back getting something to eat, I'd open up the field guide and I would look at pictures of rabbits, of their tracks, of their habits, of their scat, and you soak in that information. And then when you go out there and you see the tracks in person, and your brain, you know, it'll connect the two, and that's part of that learning process.